Hello, thank you very much for watching my talk. I'm Tom Kaspers. I'm a PhD student at the University of St. Andrews and University of Stirling. Before I get started, let me thank the Nederlandse Onderzoeksschool Wijsbegeerte for this amazing opportunity to share my work. The title of my talk is Pragmatism, Correspondence, and Alethic Pluralism. In this talk, I will show that pragmatists can accept that truth sometimes consists in correspondence by endorsing a pluralist account uh, about truth. So there are two parts to my talk. In the first part, I will argue why pragmatists should accept that truth for some domains of discourse consists in correspondence. And the second part of the talk, I will argue that pragmatists can do so. They can accept that truth consists in correspondence by endorsing a pragmatist account of Alethic pluralism. So to argue that pragmatists should accept that truth is correspondence is a very difficult task, and my arguments for it are only going to be somewhat tentative. And that's because, as I've written out on the slides, the rejection of the correspondence theory of truth has been a central tenet in most pragmatist theories throughout the history of the pragmatist tradition. So I will argue that nevertheless, there is the pragmatist has a reason to accept correspondence. But moreover, I will show that by going pluralist and by accepting a particular pluralist account of truth, the pragmatist can accept correspondence without falling prey to the typical pragmatist concerns with correspondence. So what are these typical pragmatist concerns? On the one hand, there is the kind of epistemological concern, which consists in the worry that it will be pointless to aim for truth as correspondence, because we would never know whether or not correspondence actually obtains. Perhaps sometimes we succeed in corresponding to reality, but this would be somewhat of a hollow victory because we would never know ourselves to be victorious. So in this sense, it would be pointless to aim for correspondence. The other kind of concern would be, is the metaphysical concern, which is a bit more radical. It argues that the very notion of correspondence is a piece of empty metaphysics. It has no bearing on our practices. And that's because it invokes some kinds of Archimedean point from which things are objectively correct or incorrect, regardless of our practices and regardless of our human interests. And according to some pragmatists, this transcendental notion of correctness should be avoided at all costs. So my arguments for why pragmatists should accept correspondence starts with a couple of what I think should be uncontroversial observations. The first of these observations is that certain entities are usually thought to be more metaphysically robust than others. I think this is an uncontroversial observation because I'm not saying that certain entities actually are more metaphysically robust than others. I'm only saying that we usually take certain entities like trees or buses to be more metaphysically robust than other kinds of entities like moral virtues or beauty. The second observation I make is that how we carry out our practices depends on how robust we think its related entities are. We can take mental illness as an example. It's only if I think of mental illness as being metaphysically robust that I will be willing to listen to, for instance, the neuroscientists about what they might have to tell me about mental illness. If I were to think that mental illness is merely a social construct, then I would be less willing to take the neuroscientist as an expert, and I would perhaps turn to sociologists instead. So these different metaphysical attitudes clearly do have a bearing on our practices. They do make a difference in how we carry out our practices. The final observation that I'll make is that sometimes it is useful to think of entities as being metaphysically robust. It's useful to think of viruses as being metaphysically robust. If I wouldn't think that viruses were metaphysically robust, then I would go out on the street and I would hug people, and that would not be good for my practices. It wouldn't be beneficial for my health in particular. So again, I take this to be an uncontroversial observation because I'm only saying that it's useful to think of certain entities as being metaphysically robust. I'm not saying that certain entities actually are metaphysically robust. I'm not even saying that such a thing as metaphysical robustness can really be made sense of. So this isn't very committing just yet. And the pragmatists have a couple of replies to these observations. So one reply that the pragmatist might have is a deflationist reply. So the deflationist move would be to say that, sure, our attitudes about trees and beauty are different, but that's only because they are about two different things. One of them is about trees and the other one is about beauty. We should take this difference at face value, but we shouldn't invent metaphysical stories. We shouldn't add this metaphysical layer in order to try to explain what this difference consists in. So I take this deflationist response to be a very powerful response, but it does have a shortcoming, and that's that it assumes that for a particular kind of entity, we have a widespread attitude, a widespread metaphysical attitude, and that's not true for all entities. Take as an example, gender. There are some people that think of gender as being metaphysically robust, and others that think of it as merely a social construct. And of course, this does have a bearing on our practices, because someone who thinks of gender as a metaphysically robust entity might say that we should try to celebrate the differences that come with different genders, whereas someone who thinks of gender as social construct might say, well, in the long run, we hope to eradicate the differences. We perhaps hope to eradicate gender altogether. So there are two very distinct ways of going about gender practices, which seem to be informed by two different metaphysical stories. And I believe that this metaphysical debate about gender is very useful for our gender practices, precisely because it shows these different ways of going about the practice, and because it's conceivable that someone who used to think of gender as metaphysically robust and would act accordingly would be persuaded through metaphysical debates to endorse the view that gender is a social construct, and this would result in a change in how they approach gender practices. So in this sense, the metaphysical debate about gender is very much a part of our gender practices. Here's a quote by Robert Kraut, and he says, if the metaphysical stories help sustain the practice among participants, which I think they do in the case of gender, then such stories are part of the practice, not artifacts of confused philosophical efforts visited upon the practice from an outside vantage point. So pragmatists do have to give some kind of account of these metaphysical stories. However, they don't have to say that these metaphysical stories are in any way correct. They can take them to just be stories. So one possible way of accounting for the realist attitude without invoking correspondence is to develop a kind of realism that doesn't invoke correspondence, which is the kind of reply made by Hilary Putnam with his internal realism. So internal realism is a reply to metaphysical realism. Metaphysical realism takes it to be true that even if we have an ideal theory, absolutely perfect, flawless theory, it can still be incorrect. It can still be false. And Putnam says, well, this is inconceivable. So Putnam rejects this, and he rejects this transcendental notion of correctness that it assumes. So Putnam says in the summary to his paper, Truth and Convention, I discuss a simple case in which theories with different ontologies appear equally adequate in every way. I contend that the appearance of equal adequacy is correct, and that what this shows is that the notion of existence has a variety of different but legitimate uses. So if there are different theories that appear equally adequate in every way, because Putnam doesn't want to invoke this transcendental notion of correctness, he has to say that in that case, they really are equally adequate, they're equally correct. But of course, if these theories have different ontologies, then Putnam has to say something about how these theories employ the notion of existence. So Putnam says that the notion of existence has a variety of different but legitimate uses. So he also says, which is the second quote on the slide, the idea that there is an Archimedean point or a use of exist inherent to the world itself, from which the question which things really exist makes sense, is an illusion. So you can see that in order to incorporate this insight, this rejection of a transcendental notion of correctness, of there being one true theory, or of being able to make sense of one theory amongst many that appear equally adequate in every way as being correct. In order to deny this attitude, Putnam has to say that there's no one way in which things really exist. This is an illusion. And the way I will argue, the way I will respond to this is by saying, sure, perhaps it is an illusion. I'm not going to argue against internal realism directly. But I do think Putnam has to concede that it's a useful illusion. So to think to have this attitude that whenever we're confronted with different theories that appear equally adequate in every way, only one of these theories can really be true, can really be correct, or can really be the case. That's a useful attitude to have. Of course, in the circumstance where there are multiple indefeasible theories, this attitude is absolutely pointless because we're never going to find out which one actually is correct. But in the ordinary case, where we're dealing not with indefeasible theories, I take it to be a useful, generally useful attitude to have. And that's because whenever we're confronted with theories that appear equally adequate in every way, it is not going to be the case that they actually are equally adequate in every way. Under closer scrutiny, one of them might turn out to be better than the others. And if the scientists were to accept Putnam's internal realism, and if she were to say, when confronted with these different theories, well, they're all equally correct, that would introduce some kind of stalemate. Luckily, the scientist does not do this, because the scientist usually believes in the illusion that there can only be one theory that is actually correct. So she is motivated by this illusion to press on and to try to prove one particular theory and to disprove the other theories, which again, I think is, in the ordinary case, a useful attitude for the scientist to have. Okay, so I've argued so far that it is pragmatically beneficial at times to have a realist attitude, and internal realism cannot account for all the facets of this utility. I've shown that this realist attitude invokes a transcendental notion of correctness, something like correspondence. So every step along the way in the previous slides, I've argued against the pragmatist by saying, sure, what you say might be correct. However, it is useful to think this and this, right? So in the case of the internal realist, sure, internal realism might be correct. It might just be an illusion to think, to hold on to this transcendental notion of correctness. However, it's a useful illusion to have. So I've been backing this response, which I've called quasi-realism, which would be to say, even though it might be useful to believe that truth is correspondence, or to at least act as if we believe that truth is correspondence, this does not mean that truth actually is correspondence. But actually, I don't think the pragmatist can make this move. And that's because if it's pragmatically beneficial to take truth to be correspondence, in what way would correspondence still be incorrect? In what way would it still fall short of correctness? It seems by insisting that nevertheless correspondence would be incorrect, the pragmatist is assuming themselves a transcendental notion of correctness, something that goes beyond our practices. Because as far as our practices are concerned, correspondence is fine. It's pragmatically beneficial to take truth to be correspondence. So I think that by giving this kind of response, the pragmatist would, in their attempt to reject correspondence, would accept correspondence and let it in through the back door, so to speak. Okay, so I believe that from here we can conclude that whenever there's a pragmatic value to believing that truth is correspondence, pragmatists should accept that truth really is correspondence. So I've argued so far that pragmatists should accept truth as correspondence, if and only if there's a pragmatic value to believing that truth is correspondence. We can rephrase this claim by saying, okay, so it's true that truth for domain X is correspondence, if and only if it's beneficial for us to believe that truth for domain X is correspondence. And if we put it in this way, it seems that the truth property for the meta-level claim, the truth assigning claim, truth for domain X is correspondence, is a pragmatist truth property, because it is correct if and only if it's pragmatically beneficial for us to take it to be correct. So this is a possible interpretation of the conditional acceptance of correspondence. And I think that this interpretation, this pluralist account of truth, helps us overcome the epistemological and metaphysical concerns I raised earlier. So to repeat these concerns very quickly, the epistemological concern says it is pointless to aim for correspondence because we can never know whether or not correspondence actually obtains. I've shown that it's not always pointless to aim for correspondence, and I think that the fault made by the epistemological concern is that it assumes that whenever the thing aimed for is pointless, then the aiming itself is necessarily also pointless. But this doesn't follow. The aiming itself does not have to be pointless, because it could be that this aiming generates pragmatically beneficial ways of acting. And I think that in the case of correspondence, the aiming for correspondence is, in certain circumstances, for certain domains of discourse, pragmatically beneficial. So it's not always pointless to aim for correspondence. And I think that if we accept the pluralist account of truth, then we would only accept correspondence if it is pragmatically beneficial to do so. That is, if the claim, truth for this domain of discourse is correspondence, is itself pragmatically true. So in that case, the epistemological concern simply becomes irrelevant. Then there was also the metaphysical concern, which roughly says, if correspondence has no bearing on our practices, then it's empty metaphysics. I think this, the pluralist can simply accept. If correspondence has no bearing on our practices, then it's empty metaphysics. But correspondence does have bearing on our practice, because sometimes it's pragmatically beneficial to take truth to be correspondence. So I think that this metaphysical concern actually shows a essential feature of the pragmatist account of Alethic pluralism, because it shows that this account should take pragmatist truth to be theoretically fundamental to truth as correspondence. And theoretical fundamentality is a notion used by Nathan Callan to classify certain types of accounts of Alethic pluralism. And what is meant by this in this particular context is we can only make sense of correspondence if the meta-level claim, truth for domain X is correspondence, is itself pragmatically true. So in making sense of correspondence, we rely on pragmatist truth. And in this sense, pragmatist truth is theoretically fundamental to truth as correspondence. So Nathan Callan says, as of now, there is no truth pluralism in the literature which treats anti-realism as theoretically fundamental. Nevertheless, it seems to be a conceptually possible account of truth. So I take it that the pragmatist version of Alethic pluralism should take pragmatist truth to be theoretically fundamental. And this would make it a one-of-a-kind account of pluralism. And I think that it would be a very, very appealing account of truth for the pragmatist, because it allows the pragmatist to conditionally accept correspondence without falling prey to the typical pragmatist concerns with correspondence. Okay, so to conclude, I've argued that sometimes it's beneficial to believe that truth is correspondence. I've then shown that whenever there's a pragmatic value to believing that truth is correspondence, pragmatists must accept that truth really is correspondence. So for the pragmatist, truth is correspondence if and only if there's a pragmatic value to taking it to be correspondence. And that means that the pragmatist must conditionally accept correspondence. And there is a way of interpreting this conditional acceptance of correspondence that leads to a new kind of Alethic pluralism, which takes pragmatist truth to be theoretically fundamental to correspondence. And finally, I've argued that if the pragmatist endorses this account, this pluralist account of truth, then she can accept correspondence without having to worry too much about the typical pragmatist concerns with correspondence. Okay, that was my talk. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the event.